everyone, this is Lizzy from thishouseofcards.blogspot.com. I'm going to share a fun Valentine's Day card with you featuring the new Science of Love stamp set by Lawn Fawn. So this is the new stamp set I'll be using. It has a lot of really great images in it. I especially like those cute birds and the flask images. I think they're really great for coloring. I'm also using Milo's ABCs and the Into the Wood 6x6 paper pad. To make this card, I first start with creating the background, and I want a subtle look, so I make a watercolor background using spun sugar and squeezed lemonade distress inks. I start by spreading the ink on a craft mat and spritzing it with water until the ink beads up. I then dab my watercolor paper into the ink until the entire cardstock panel is covered. And then, once I'm happy with the result, I go ahead and just heat set it really quick. Just because I'm too impatient to let the panel dry on its own. And I thought the panel looked a little bit too yellow, so I went back and used just the pink ink and applied it over the original color and heat set it again. And there you have the finished background. So next, I stamp out the images using Memento Tuxedo black ink because I'll be using Copic markers to color in the images. And so the way I do my coloring is probably the way most everyone else does theirs, but I start with the lightest color, and in this case it's R01, and completely color the entire image. Now if the image were larger, I probably would color it in sections, but since it's so small, the ink will stay wet long enough to finish coloring the whole thing. So now I'm going in with the darkest color, which is R05, and color where I want the shadows to be. After that, I go in with my medium shade, which is R02, and start blending the darker color into the medium color. I do this by feathering in the medium color from the sides, and then using little circles to blend the transition between the dark and medium colors. So after the dark and medium shades are blended, I go back in with my lightest shade and blend everything together. Now for this image, I thought the highlight in the center was a little bit too broad, so I went back in with the medium color and blended everything just a little bit more until I was happy with the result. And then I just used Y15 for her beak. So for the next little bird, I use the same technique for coloring. I start with Y00 as my lightest shade. I then use Y15 as my darkest shade for the shadows. And go back in and blend that with Y02, which is the medium shade. And I really think the trick for making these images look dimensional is to be mindful of wherever you want the highlight to be and don't color over it with the darker shades. And that way that area stays nice and light in color and really gives the images a lot of dimension. So after the dark and medium colors are blended, I go back in with Y00, which is my lightest shade, and again blend everything together. And then I also used Y15 for the beak on this little bird too. And since I love little details on cards, I thought it would be fun to color the bird's glasses as though the other bird were reflecting in them. So I used R02 and R01, which were the medium and light shades for the other bird, and blended together with Y00. So for the rest of these images, I used the same color of markers and the same coloring technique as I did for the birds. Again, just being mindful to leave that highlight in the center to make the flask appear round. And you'll notice that I colored outside of the lines, but I just used my colorless blender to push the yellow towards the black line to erase it. This is really a fun set for practicing coloring because the images aren't too small where you can't see any blending and aren't too large where coloring can become overwhelming. Plus there are a lot of round images which are really easy to add dimension to by creating that highlight in the center. So I really like this set for coloring. Now for this last class, it's going to be spilled over, so I'm coloring it as though the liquid were on top. And I'm using RV02, RV13, and RV25. And once everything is colored, I'm going to use the coordinating dies and cut all the images out. So I went ahead and cut a few strips of the wood grain pattern paper from the Into the Wood 6x6 paper pad, and I'm just getting an idea of where everything will be placed on the card. I just want to make sure that that shelf is low enough so I'll have enough room to stamp that vapor trail. And then once I have the height of the shelf correct, I can place little tick marks where the opening of the spilled over flask will be. I can then position the little yellow bird and draw a light pencil line in the shape of a triangle so I can have a guide for stamping all the little hearts that will be cascading down on him. So to create the look of a spilled love potion, I used the little solid heart image that comes with the stamp set and a few colors of red and pink inks, and start stamping using the pencil marks as my guide. I want it to look as though the hearts are cascading down, so I condense the hearts at the top and scatter them farther apart as they get closer to the ground. I start by using the darkest color ink, and then the medium ink, and then filling everything in with the lightest ink, just until I'm happy with the result. So before I can assemble my card, I need to stamp my sentiment, and I went ahead and mounted it on a stamp press. I'll be doing some heat embossing, so I prep my pattern paper with my embossing tool and then ink up my sentiment really well with Versamark ink, which is a nice sticky ink for embossing. And then I stamp. And the great thing about Milo's ABCs is it has about 1 million of each letter, but it does only have one U, so I did go back and stamp that U separately off camera. And now I'm using some Zing embossing powder in the color of Butter, which is a really pretty yellow, and just put that on the paper, and then I will set it. So now it's time to assemble the card, and I've gone ahead and adhered the sentiment to the bottom of the cardstock to serve as a ground for the birds. And now I'm assembling the shelf for the flask, and I want it to look as though there's molding on the shelf, so I just added a thin strip of paper to the top of the shelf, and I'm adhering the whole thing with some liquid glue and cutting off the excess. So now I've positioned all the images where I want them to be and started adhering everything with liquid glue. But before I adhere that yellow flask, I need to stamp that vapor trail first so that the yellow flask can be positioned correctly, and then I can go ahead and finish adhering the remaining flask. So after adhering everything, there was a little empty space between the pink and yellow flasks, which really bothered me. But fortunately, the stamp set includes a test tube image, which was perfect to fill in that space. So now to finish up the card, I've scored and folded a standard size card, which is 5.5 by 4.25, and can mount the cardstock panel onto the card base. And there you have it, a fun little Valentine's Day card featuring Lawn Fawn Science of Love stamp set. Thanks so much for watching. You can see more of my cards at thishouseofcards.blogspot.com.